London, April 1816. The narrow streets of St. Giles lay shrouded in morning mist, the kind that clung to crumbling brick and broken dreams with unyielding grasp. In a cramped room above a gin shop, Eleanor Ashby waited before a cracked mirror, her hands trembling as she fastened the last button of her only decent dress. At 20 years of age, Eleanor understood with perfect clarity what this morning would bring. Her stepfather, Mr. Blackwell, had made his intentions horrifyingly clear 3 days prior, when he had sold her to Mrs. Dalton to settle his gambling debts. The respectable term was companion. The reality was something Eleanor refused to name aloud, though it haunted her every waking moment since. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made her spine stiffen. They were coming for her now, and there was nowhere left to run. If stories of courage found in the darkest moments move your heart, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You won't want to miss what happens next. The door was violently flung open. 2 men Eleanor did not recognize filled the doorway, their expressions as cold as the morning air that rushed in behind them. Behind them stood Mr. Blackwell, his face flushed with drink, though it was barely past dawn. "Time to settle accounts, girl," he said, and Eleanor heard neither regret nor shame in his voice, only the satisfied tone of a man who had found a solution to his problems, regardless of the cost to others. "I will go peacefully," Eleanor said, lifting her chin through her heart hammered against her ribs. "There is no need for force." "Smart girl," one of the men grunted, stepping forward to grasp her arm with unnecessary roughness. "Mrs. Dalton appreciates cooperation." Eleanor allowed herself to be led down the narrow stairs, through the gin shop where the proprietor carefully avoided her eyes, and out into the street where a plain carriage waited. The vehicle bore no markings, no coat of arms, nothing to distinguish it from a dozen others that might traverse these streets. It was designed for discretion, for transporting cargo that should not be seen. As the men moved to push her toward the carriage door, Eleanor took one last look at the street where she had lived these past 2 miserable years since her mother's death. St. Giles was not much, but it had been something. What awaited her in Mrs. Dalton's establishment was a descent into a darkness from which there could be no return. It was then that fate intervened in the most unexpected manner. A voice, cultured and commanding, cut through the morning air like a blade. "Release that woman immediately." Eleanor's head snapped toward the sound. A tall gentleman stood perhaps 20 feet away, his greatcoat marking him as unmistakably quality despite the squalor of his surroundings. Behind him stood 3 servants, their postures alert and ready. The man holding Eleanor's arm hesitated, his hold visibly wavered. "This ain't your concern, sir." "I am making it my concern." The gentleman moved closer, and Eleanor found herself staring at a face that belonged in a drawing room in Mayfair, not in the depths of St. Giles. Angular features, dark hair beneath a beaver hat, and eyes that missed nothing. "I said release her. I will not repeat myself." "Look here," Mr. Blackwell stepped forward, puffing himself up with false courage. "I have every legal right to dispose of the girl as I see fit, as she is my stepdaughter, and this is a family matter." "Legal right?" The gentleman's voice dropped to something dangerously quiet. "To sell a woman to settle your gambling debts? I think not." The moment hung heavy and still. Eleanor held her breath, scarcely daring to hope. Then the gentleman made a sharp gesture, and his servants moved with sharp accord. Within seconds, the 2 men who had held Eleanor were immediately confronted by opponents who clearly knew how to handle themselves in a fight. "Get in the carriage, Mr." Blackwell hissed at Eleanor, making a grab for her arm himself. But Eleanor had already stepped back, her legs carrying her away from the carriage and toward the gentleman who had appeared like a figure of sudden, vivid clarity. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do not know who you are, sir, but if you would extend your protection just long enough for me to find employment elsewhere, I would be forever grateful." The gentleman studied her face with an intensity that made Eleanor feel exposed in ways that had nothing to do with the tattered state of her dress. His gaze traveled from her carefully mended gloves to the stubborn pride in her bearing, and something shifted in his expression. "What is your name?" "Eleanor Ashby, sir." And these men were taking you to Mrs. Dalton's establishment. Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. Yes, sir. Against my will, though my stepfather claims he has the right. He does not. The gentleman turned to face Mr. Blackwell, who had gone rather pale. Whatever agreement you made with Mrs. Dalton is void as of this moment. If you approach Miss Ashby again, I will have you arrested for attempted trafficking. Am I understood? You cannot just, Mr. Blackwell began, but one look at the gentleman's face silenced him. I am Richard Beaufort, Marquess of Helmsley, the gentleman said, his voice backed by the authority of his rank. Would you care to test whether I can do exactly as I say? Mr. Blackwell and his hired men retreated to the carriage with a speed that would have been comical. As the vehicle rattled away over cobblestones, Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief, so profound it was almost painful. Thank you, she managed, though the words seemed impossibly inadequate. I do not know how I shall ever repay such kindness. Walk with me, Miss Ashby. The Marquess gestured toward his own carriage, far grander than the one that had just departed. We must speak frankly about your situation, and this is hardly the place for such a conversation. Eleanor knew she should be wary of entering a strange gentleman's carriage, even one who had just rescued her. But what choice remained? Mr. Blackwell would return with reinforcements, or Mrs. Dalton would send others. Very well, my lord, she said. The interior of the carriage was appointed with a luxury Eleanor had not known since her father's passing, which now felt a lifetime away. Velvet cushions, polished wood, and the faint scent of expensive tobacco made St. Giles feel a lifetime away. The Marquess settled opposite her, his expression reserved. Tell me about yourself, Miss Ashby. How did you come to such circumstances? Eleanor took a breath, gathering the fragments of her dignity. My father was a schoolmaster, my lord, a good man who believed in education and integrity. When he died, my mother remarried poorly. Mr. Blackwell seemed respectable at first, but after the wedding, his true nature emerged. He is a gambler and a drunkard. When my mother died of pneumonia this past winter, he claimed ownership of me as his stepdaughter. Last week, he informed me he had sold me to Mrs. Dalton to settle his debts. And you have no other family? None, my lord. My father was an only child, and my mother was an only child as well. I am alone in the world, save for a stepfather who would see me sold for the price of his next wager. The Marquess was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the carriage window. When he spoke again, his voice held a quality Eleanor could not quite identify. I had a sister once. She was 15 when a man much like your stepfather tried to sell her to pay his debts. I was too young then, too powerless to prevent it. By the time I learned what had happened, it was too late. She took her own life rather than face what awaited her. He looked at Eleanor then, his gaze intense, and she was reminded of his sister's unbreakable spirit. I am deeply sorry, my lord, as am I. He returned his attention to her, and Eleanor saw something fierce and determined in his eyes. I swore then that if I ever had the power to prevent such a fate for another woman, I would not hesitate. That is why I was in St. Giles this morning. I recently inherited several properties in that area and was inspecting them. Your rescue was not chance, Miss Ashby. It was providence. What you have done for me is more than I can ever repay, Eleanor said carefully. But I must find employment, my lord, a position as a governess, perhaps, or a lady's companion. I am educated. My father saw to that. I can teach, I can read and write in French and Italian, I can manage accounts. All admirable accomplishments, the Marquess said, but they will not protect you from Mr. Blackwell or Mrs. Dalton. Your stepfather still has legal rights over you until you marry or reach the age of 21. Mrs. Dalton has connections throughout London. If I simply deposit you at an employment agency, you will be vulnerable within a week. The truth of his words settled over Eleanor like ice water. She had known, of course, that escape would not be simple, but hearing it stated so plainly made her situation feel even more hopeless. Then what am I to do? She whispered. The Marquess leaned forward, his expression earnest. I am about to make you an unusual proposal, Miss Ashby. Please hear me out completely before you respond. Eleanor nodded, her heart beginning to race again. My family has been pressuring me to marry for the past 5 years. I am 35, and they consider it past time I secured the succession. However, I have no desire to marry simply to satisfy their demands. What I propose is this. You will accompany me to my London residence as my betrothed. The engagement will provide you with legal protection that Mr. Blackwell cannot challenge. During our betrothal, my grandmother, the Dowager Marchioness, will train you in all the accomplishments expected of a lady of rank. At the end of 3 months, we will quietly dissolve the engagement, and I will arrange for you to receive a substantial settlement that will allow you to live independently. Eleanor stared at him, certain she must have misheard. You would claim me as your betrothed? But I am nobody, my lord. The daughter of a schoolmaster, currently residing in St. Giles. Your family would never accept such a thing. They will have no choice, the Marquis said flatly, and that is precisely the point. I intend to make my grandmother a wager. She will have 3 months to train you as a proper Marchioness. If she succeeds to her satisfaction, I will honor the engagement and marry you in truth. If she fails, she must cease her demands that I marry and accept my choice to remain unwed. But what if she succeeds? Eleanor asked, her voice barely audible. You would actually marry me? I would honor my word, the Marquis said simply, but I confess I have little faith in my grandmother's ability to transform anyone in so short a time. She is exacting in her standards. No, Miss Ashby, I expect that in 3 months' time you will walk away with enough funds to establish yourself comfortably, and I will finally have peace from my family's matrimonial ambitions. It was madness. The enormity of the risk was a weight pressing in on her. Yet as Eleanor considered her alternatives, the madness began to take on the shape of possibility. And if I refuse, she asked, then I will help you find employment as best I can, though I warn you the protection it offers will be limited. Eleanor looked down at her hands, at the carefully mended gloves that concealed calluses from washing clothes and scrubbing floors. 3 months of living as a lady. 3 months of learning accomplishments she had only read about in books. 3 months of safety from Mr. Blackwell and Mrs. Dalton, and at the end enough money to choose her own path. I accept your proposal, my lord, she said, meeting his eyes, and I give you my word that I will do everything in my power to meet your grandmother's standards, however exacting they may be. Something that might have been respect flickered across the Marquis's features. Then we have an agreement, Miss Ashby. Or should I say, my dear betrothed? The carriage rolled through the streets of London, carrying Eleanor away from St. Giles and toward a future she could never have imagined. She watched through the window as the buildings gradually transformed from cramped and crumbling to elegant and imposing. They were entering Mayfair, the very heart of aristocratic London. When the carriage finally stopped, Eleanor found herself staring up at a townhouse of such magnificence that her breath caught in her throat. 4 stories of pristine white stone, windows gleaming in the late morning light, and a front door painted a glossy black with brass fittings that probably cost more than everything she had ever owned. Welcome to Helmsley House, the Marquis said, offering his hand to help her descend. Your home for the next 3 months. A butler opened the door before they reached it, his expression perfectly neutral as he took in Eleanor's shabby appearance. My lord, we were not expecting you to return so soon. I bring news, Morrison. Please have Mrs. Henderson prepare the blue guest room immediately, and send word to my grandmother that I require her presence at her earliest convenience. Very good, my lord. The butler's gaze flickered to Eleanor again, curiosity evident despite his professional demeanor. This is Miss Eleanor Ashby, the Marquis said clearly. My betrothed. She is to be treated with all the respect due to the future Marchioness of Helmsley. If Morrison was shocked, he concealed it masterfully. Of course, my lord. Miss Ashby, may I take your cloak? Eleanor realized with a flush of embarrassment that her cloak was hardly worth the name, more patches than original fabric, but she removed it with as much dignity as she could muster and placed it in the butler's waiting hands. The interior of Helmsley House took Eleanor's breath away. Marble floors, soaring ceilings painted with classical scenes, furniture that belonged in a museum. A chandelier hung in the entrance hall that contained more candles than Eleanor had seen lit in her entire life. Perhaps Miss Ashby would like to refresh herself before meeting your grandmother, my lord, Morrison suggested tactfully. An excellent idea. Miss Ashby, Morrison will show you to your rooms. I suggest you rest. My grandmother will arrive within the hour, and I assure you, you will need all your strength for the encounter. Eleanor was shown upstairs by a young maid who introduced herself as Annie and seemed desperate to ask questions, but too well trained to do so. The blue guest room proved to be larger than the entire flat Eleanor had shared with her mother and stepfather. A four-poster bed dominated the space, hung with silk curtains in a shade of blue that reminded Eleanor of summer skies. A dressing table, a wardrobe, a writing desk, and a fireplace completed the furnishings, each piece more expensive than anything Eleanor had touched in years. "Shall I draw you a bath, miss?" Annie asked shyly. "Yes, please," Eleanor managed, still trying to comprehend the transformation her life had undergone in the space of 2 hours. While Annie prepared the bath in the adjoining room, Eleanor moved to the window and looked down at the street below. Fine carriages passed by, ladies and gentlemen strolling with the casual confidence of those who belonged in such surroundings. This was to be her world for 3 months, and if the Dowager Marchioness had her way, perhaps forever. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The bathwater was hot and scented with lavender, a luxury Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. She washed away the grime of St. Giles with soap that smelled of roses and tried to prepare herself mentally for what was to come. The Marquess had warned her his grandmother was exacting. Eleanor suspected that was a considerable understatement. She had barely finished dressing in a borrowed gown that Annie produced from somewhere when a commotion downstairs announced the Dowager Marchioness's arrival. "Where is my grandson?" a voice demanded, carrying clearly up the stairs. "And what is this nonsense Morrison tells me about a betrothal?" Eleanor's hands went cold. She smoothed down the borrowed dress, squared her shoulders, and walked to the door of her room. If she was to face the Dowager, she would do so with her head held high. The woman who stood in the entrance hall was 70 years old if she was a day, but age had done nothing to diminish the force of her personality. She stood ramrod straight in a gown of severe black silk, her white hair dressed in an elaborate style that suggested she had come from some important engagement. Her eyes, dark and sharp as a bird's, missed nothing as they swept over Eleanor descending the stairs. "Grandmother," the Marquess said, moving forward to kiss her cheek, "thank you for coming so promptly." "Do not attempt to charm me, Richard," the Dowager said tartly. "Morrison says you have brought home a betrothed. I assume this is some sort of jest." "No jest, I assure you. Grandmother, may I present Miss Eleanor Ashby, my betrothed? Eleanor, this is my grandmother, the Dowager Marchioness of Helmsley." Eleanor executed what she hoped was an acceptable curtsy. "Your Grace, it is an honor to make your acquaintance." The Dowager's eyes narrowed as she studied Eleanor from head to toe, taking in every detail of her appearance with the thoroughness of a general inspecting troops. The silence stretched until Eleanor felt sweat begin to prickle at the back of her neck. "Where did you find her, Richard? She has the bearing of a gentlewoman, I will grant you that, but her gown has seen better days and she is far too thin." "I found her in St. Giles this morning, being forced into a carriage bound for a brothel." The Dowager's expression did not change, but Eleanor saw her hands tighten on her walking stick. "I see. And you decided to make her your betrothed as an act of charity?" "I decided to make her my betrothed because she interests me," the Marquess said, his tone brooking no argument. "However, I recognize that she lacks the training expected of a Marchioness. That is where you come in, grandmother." "I beg your pardon?" "I propose a wager. You have 3 months to train Miss Ashby in everything a lady of rank should know. Etiquette, dance, languages, music, household management, the intricacies of society. If at the end of 3 months you are satisfied that she has met your exacting standards, I will marry her and provide you with the heir you have been insisting upon. If you fail, you will cease your demands that I marry and accept my decision to remain unwed." The Dowager's eyes glinted with something that might have been anger or might have been challenge. "And if I refuse this absurd wager, then I will marry Miss Ashby immediately, without your leave or counsel, and you may watch your grandson make a public spectacle in society." Eleanor held her breath as grandmother and grandson faced each other in a battle of wills that had clearly been years in the making. Finally, the Dowager smiled, and it was not a kind expression. "Very well, Richard. I accept your wager. Miss Ashby, You will present yourself in the morning room tomorrow at 6 o'clock in the morning. We have a great deal of work to do, and I warn you now, I do not tolerate laziness or stupidity. You will work harder than you have ever worked in your life, and you will meet standards that most girls of good breeding spend 18 years learning. Do you understand? I understand, Your Grace, Eleanor said, and I promise you I will not disappoint. We shall see about that. The dowager turned to her grandson. I hope you know what you're doing, Richard. As do I, grandmother, the Marquess replied. As do I. After the dowager departed in a rustle of silk and barely suppressed fury, the Marquess turned to Eleanor with an expression that might have been apologetic. I must warn you, Miss Ashby, my grandmother is not given to half measures. She will push you to your absolute limits. There have been discreet inquiries from Mrs. Dalton during my absence, so the danger has not passed. I am not afraid of hard work, my lord, Eleanor said. You have given me an opportunity I never dreamed possible. I will not squander it. I believe you, he said, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Now I suggest you rest. Tomorrow your transformation begins, and I fear it will make this morning's events seem like a pleasant stroll. That night, Eleanor lay in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds and stared at the canopy above her head. This morning she had been facing a future of unspeakable horror. Tonight she was the betrothed of a Marquess, residing in a house in Mayfair, preparing to learn the ways of the aristocracy. The question that kept her awake long into the night was simple. Could she possibly succeed, or would she prove in the end that some distances were simply too far to bridge? Morning came far too soon. Eleanor woke to Annie gently shaking her shoulder, sunlight barely touching the horizon outside her window. Begging your pardon, miss, but it is 5:30. Her Grace the Dowager expects you at 6 o'clock sharp, and she does not tolerate lateness. Eleanor dressed in another borrowed gown, this one a simple day dress in pale green muslin that hung loosely on her thin frame. Annie did what she could with Eleanor's hair, pinning it up in a style that was meant to be fashionable, but which Eleanor suspected looked rather amateur. The morning room proved to be a bright space on the ground floor, furnished with delicate chairs and watercolor paintings of pastoral scenes. The dowager sat at a small writing desk, already dressed as though she were about to attend a royal audience. You are 3 minutes late, she said, without looking up from the letter she was writing. That is unacceptable. A lady is either precisely on time or early, never late. I apologize, Your Grace, Eleanor said, moving to stand before the desk. Apologies are meaningless without changed behavior. Sit. Eleanor sat in the chair indicated, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap as her father had taught her long ago. The dowager finished her letter, sealed it with practiced efficiency, and finally turned her full attention to Eleanor. The scrutiny was even more intense than the previous evening, and Eleanor forced herself not to fidget under that penetrating gaze. Tell me about your education, the dowager commanded. My father was a schoolmaster, Your Grace. He believed that education should not be denied to anyone based on their sex. I can read and write in English, French, and Italian. I have studied history, literature, mathematics, natural philosophy. I can sketch adequately and have some knowledge of music, though I have not touched a pianoforte in many years. Can you dance? I know the basic steps of country dances, but I have never attended a ball or learned the more complex dances such as the waltz. Can you manage a household? Plan menus, oversee servants, manage accounts? I can manage accounts and plan simple menus, but I have no experience overseeing servants beyond a single maid. The dowager's lips thinned. You have the foundation of education, which is more than I expected. But you lack every social grace necessary to move in the highest circles. We have 3 months to transform you from a schoolmaster's daughter into a woman capable of being Marchioness of Helmsley. It will require dedication beyond anything you have experienced. I am prepared to work as hard as necessary, Your Grace. Words are easy, Miss Ashby. We shall see if your actions match them. Your schedule will be as follows. 6 o'clock, you will present yourself here for inspection and discussion of the day's lessons. 7 o'clock, breakfast. 8 o'clock until noon, lessons in deportment, etiquette, and the complexities of society. Noon, a light luncheon. 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock, lessons in music, dance, art, or needlework as I determine. 5 o'clock tea. 6 o'clock until 8 o'clock, study of genealogy and memorization of important families. 8 o'clock, dinner. 9 o'clock until 10 o'clock, review of the day's lessons. After 10 o'clock you may retire. Eleanor calculated quickly. That was 16 hours of structured activity each day, with scarcely a moment for rest between lessons. It was brutal. It was also exactly what she needed. I understand, Your Grace. Good. Now stand and walk across the room. Eleanor stood and walked to the far wall, then back again, aware of the dowager's eyes tracking her every movement. Your posture is adequate but needs refinement. You take steps that are too long. A lady glides, she does not stride. Your hands should move gracefully at your sides, not hang like dead fish. We will work on your walk until it becomes second nature. And so began what Eleanor would later think of as the most grueling 3 months of her life. The dowager was relentless in her pursuit of perfection. Eleanor spent hours learning to walk properly, to sit, to rise, to enter a room, to pour tea without a single drop spilled. She practiced curtsying until her knees ached, learned the precise depth required for each rank of nobility, memorized the forms of address for every title in the peerage. Languages proved easier, as her father's education had given her a strong foundation. But the dowager was not satisfied with mere competence. Eleanor was required to converse fluently in French and Italian, to understand the nuances of court language, to recognize literary allusions that were common currency among the educated elite. Music was torture. The pianoforte was an instrument that demanded daily practice, and Eleanor's fingers were stiff from years of disuse. She practiced scales until her hands cramped, learned simple pieces, graduated to more complex compositions. The dowager would accept nothing less than competent performance, though she acknowledged that true mastery was beyond reach in so short a time. Dancing proved surprisingly enjoyable once Eleanor mastered the basic steps. A dancing master was hired, a thin gentleman named Monsieur Dubois, who spoke with a heavy French accent and had the patience of a saint. He taught her the quadrille, the cotillion, country dances, and finally the waltz. The intimacy of the waltz shocked Eleanor the first time Monsieur Dubois placed his hand at her waist, but she learned to move through the steps with reasonable grace. Watercolor painting was a disaster. Eleanor could sketch adequately, but capturing the delicate washes and subtle gradations required for fashionable watercolors eluded her completely. After 2 weeks of frustration, the dowager waved her hand dismissively. Some talents cannot be forced. We will tell society you prefer literature to art and leave it at that. Needlework was similarly abandoned after Eleanor proved capable of basic mending, but utterly hopeless at the elaborate embroidery that ladies use to showcase their skills. The dowager was philosophical about these failures. You cannot excel at everything, Miss Ashby. The key is to know your strengths and weaknesses, and to steer conversation toward the former, while deflecting attention from the latter. The study of genealogy and society was perhaps the most daunting task of all. The dowager possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every important family in England, their connections, their scandals, their alliances. Eleanor was required to memorize it all. Who was related to whom, who had quarreled with whom, which families were rising and which were falling, which marriages were considered brilliant and which were cause for whispered speculation. Society is a battlefield, Miss Ashby, the dowager explained during one particularly exhausting session. Information is your weapon and knowledge of your fellow combatants is your armor. The lady who enters a drawing room without understanding the relationships and tensions present is a lamb among wolves. The Marquess himself was notably absent during these first weeks. He departed for his properties in Northumberland the day after presenting Eleanor to his grandmother, citing urgent estate business that required his attention. Eleanor told herself it was for the best. His presence would only complicate an already complex situation. Yet she found herself thinking of him at odd moments. The way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, the intensity in his eyes when he spoke of his lost sister, the respect he had shown her, despite her circumstances. It was dangerous to attach any sentiment to their arrangement, and yet Eleanor could not quite suppress a small, treacherous hope. By the end of the first month, Eleanor was exhausted down to her bones. She fell into bed each night too tired even to dream, and woke each morning to face another 16 hours of relentless instruction. Her hands bore calluses from practicing the pianoforte, her feet ached from dancing, and her mind felt stuffed to bursting with genealogical information. But something was changing. When Eleanor caught sight of herself in a mirror, she no longer saw the desperate girl from St. Giles. Her posture had transformed, her movements had acquired grace, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of confidence rather than fear. The Dowager noticed, of course. She noticed everything. "You are making progress, Miss Ashby," she said one morning during their daily inspection. "More progress than I anticipated, I confess, but do not allow it to make you complacent. The real test will come when you face society itself." That test came sooner than Eleanor expected. At the end of the 6th week, the Dowager announced that Eleanor would be attending a small gathering at the home of Lady Winthrop, a close friend of the Dowager's and a woman whose opinions carried considerable weight in society. "This will be your first appearance in company beyond these walls," the Dowager said. "Lady Winthrop is aware of your situation and has agreed to help evaluate your progress. You will be subjected to questions, both polite and probing. How you handle yourself will determine whether we continue with this experiment or acknowledge defeat." Eleanor felt her stomach clench with anxiety. "What if I fail, Your Grace?" "Then we fail together, Miss Ashby," the Dowager said, and Eleanor heard something almost kind in her voice. "But I do not believe you will fail. You have worked harder than any girl I have ever taught. You possess intelligence, determination, and a quality that cannot be taught, which is genuine dignity. Those advantages are not inconsiderable." The day of the gathering arrived with unsettling speed. Eleanor was dressed in a gown that had been made especially for her, a creation in ivory silk with delicate embroidery at the hem and sleeves. Annie dressed her hair in an elaborate style that made her look older and more sophisticated. When Eleanor looked in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman who stared back. "You look beautiful, miss," Annie said shyly. "His lordship will be that pleased when he sees you." Eleanor felt a flutter in her chest at the mention of the Marquess. He had sent several letters during his absence, each one formal and polite, inquiring after her progress. She had responded in kind, careful to maintain the proper distance their arrangement required, but privately she wondered what he would think of her transformation. Lady Winthrop's townhouse was in Grosvenor Square, a testament to her considerable wealth and status. The Dowager and Eleanor were shown into a drawing room where 5 other ladies already sat, teacups balanced on delicate saucers. The conversation died the moment they entered. "Margaret," Lady Winthrop rose to greet the Dowager with genuine warmth. "How delightful to see you, and this must be the famous Miss Ashby." "Indeed," the Dowager said. "Eleanor, may I present Lady Winthrop, an old and dear friend?" Eleanor curtsied with the precise depth appropriate for a Viscountess. "Lady Winthrop, it is an honor to make your acquaintance." "The honor is mine, my dear." Lady Winthrop studied Eleanor with shrewd eyes that reminded her of the Dowager. "Your dedication is quite remarkable. Come, sit beside me and tell me how you are finding London." The next hour was one of the most challenging Eleanor had yet experienced. The questions came from all sides, some gentle, some probing, and a few that were clearly designed to expose any weakness in her education or background. Where had she grown up? What was her family? How had she met the Marquess? What were her accomplishments? Eleanor answered each question with careful honesty, neither embellishing nor apologizing for her circumstances. When Lady Selborne, a woman with a pinched face and suspicious eyes, asked directly about Eleanor's father's profession, Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "My father was a schoolmaster, Lady Selborne. He was a gentleman by birth, but chose to pursue a career in education, believing it the noblest of professions. I am proud to be his daughter." "A schoolmaster," Lady Selborne repeated, making the word sound like an insult. "How very unusual." "Indeed," Eleanor agreed pleasantly. "He believed that a mind well educated is worth more than a title well inherited. I confess I share his opinion." There was a moment of shocked silence, and then Lady Winthrop laughed, a rich sound that shattered the brittle silence. "Well said, Miss Ashby. I begin to fathom the regard the Marquess holds for you." The conversation moved on to safer topics like music, literature, and the upcoming season. Eleanor contributed where appropriate, careful not to dominate, but also not to fade into the background. By the time they departed Lady Winthrop's home, Eleanor felt wrung out, but cautiously optimistic. "You handled yourself well," the Dowager said as their carriage rolled through the streets. "Lady Selborne was testing you, and you neither cowed to her nor showed inappropriate pride. That balance is difficult to achieve. Thank you, Your Grace. I hope I did not embarrass you." "You did not." The Dowager was quiet for a moment, then added, "My grandson chose better than he knew when he brought you home, Miss Ashby. You have substance beneath the surface. That is rare." Eleanor felt warmth flood through her at the praise. Coming from the exacting Dowager, it meant more than any elaborate compliment. The second month passed in a blur of continued lessons, but now with a subtle shift. The Dowager began to treat Eleanor less like a student and more like a protégée. She shared stories of her own early days in society, the mistakes she had made, the lessons she had learned. Eleanor found herself genuinely enjoying their time together, appreciating the sharp wit and surprising warmth that lay beneath the Dowager's severe exterior. It was during the 10th week that the Marquess sent word he would be returning to London within the fortnight. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken at the news. Would he be pleased with her transformation, or would he see through the elegant gowns and practiced manners to the frightened girl from St. Giles she had been just weeks ago? "Stop fretting," the Dowager said, observing Eleanor's distraction during a lesson on household management. "My grandson is not a fool. He will see what I see, which is a young woman of intelligence and character who has worked remarkably hard to master skills that should take years to learn. But what if he is disappointed? Then he is a fool after all, and you are well rid of him," the Dowager said tartly, "though I suspect that will not be the case." The day the Marquess returned, Eleanor was in the music room practicing a Mozart sonata when she heard the commotion of his arrival. Her hands stilled on the keys, her heart suddenly racing. She wanted to run to the entrance hall to see his reaction to her transformation, but that would be improper. Instead, she remained at the pianoforte, continuing to play though her fingers trembled slightly on the keys. She heard his voice in the hallway, heard him speaking with Morrison, heard his footsteps approaching the music room. The door opened, and Eleanor forced herself to continue playing until she reached the end of the phrase. Only then did she turn to face him. The Marquess stood in the doorway, travel-stained from his journey, but still commanding in his presence. His eyes swept over her, taking in the elegant gown, the carefully dressed hair, the confident posture. Something flickered in his expression which Eleanor could not quite read. "Miss Ashby," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "you are looking well." "Thank you, my lord." Eleanor rose and curtsied with perfect grace. "I trust your journey was pleasant." "Tolerable, though long." He moved into the room, his gaze never leaving her face. "My grandmother tells me you have been an exemplary student. Her Grace has been most patient with me." "That is not a phrase I have ever heard applied to my grandmother." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "She must see genuine promise in you." Before Eleanor could respond, the Dowager herself appeared in the doorway. "Richard, you are home. Excellent. We have much to discuss." The Marquess turned to his grandmother, and Eleanor saw the affection in his eyes despite his formal manner. "I understand you have been working Miss Ashby quite hard, grandmother." "Hard work builds character," the Dowager said briskly, "and Miss Ashby has proven to possess character in abundance. I have a proposal for you, Richard. 3 weeks remain in our wager. I propose we move forward with a true test of Miss Ashby's progress. A gathering here at Helmsley House, where she will be presented to society as your betrothed. If she succeeds in navigating such an event with grace and propriety, I will consider my part of the wager fulfilled." Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice. A public gathering, dozens of judgmental eyes scrutinizing her every move, every word, every gesture. The Marquess studied his grandmother's face, then turned to Eleanor. "What say you, Miss Ashby? Do you feel prepared for such a test?" Eleanor thought of her father, whose belief in education was absolute. She thought of the Dowager, who had pushed her beyond what she thought possible. She thought of Richard standing somewhere in the room, watching her with those dark, intense eyes. "I believe I am ready, my lord," she said, keeping her voice steady. "Though I confess the prospect is daunting." Honesty, the Marquess said with approval. That is a quality many in society have forgotten. Very well, grandmother. Arrange your gathering. Miss Ashby shall have her chance to prove herself. The next 3 weeks were a fever of preparation. The Dowager spared no expense in making certain the gathering would be a triumph. Invitations were sent to carefully selected members of society. Musicians were hired. The kitchens were transformed into a hive of activity as elaborate dishes were planned and prepared. And through it all, Eleanor continued her lessons with renewed intensity. The Marquess remained at Helmsley House, and Eleanor found herself increasingly aware of his presence. He attended some of her lessons, offering quiet encouragement. He took her riding in Hyde Park during the fashionable promenade hour, allowing her to be seen at his side. He treated her with a respect and consideration that made Eleanor's carefully guarded heart begin to develop feelings she knew were dangerous. During a particularly difficult dancing lesson, Eleanor stumbled and nearly fell. The Marquess, who had been partnering her at Monsieur Dubois' insistence, caught her with easy strength. "Forgive me," Eleanor said, flustered by his nearness. "I seem to have lost the rhythm." "You are trying too hard," the Marquess said gently. "Stop thinking about the steps and simply feel the music. Trust yourself, Miss Ashby." His hand remained at her waist, warm through the thin fabric of her gown. Eleanor met his eyes and saw something there that made her breath catch, but before she could identify it, he stepped back, breaking the moment. "Shall we try again?" They danced, and this time Eleanor let herself relax into the movement. To her surprise, the steps came naturally, and when the dance ended, Monsieur Dubois was beaming. "Magnifique! You see, Miss Ashby, when you trust yourself, you are capable of great grace." That night, Eleanor lay in her bed and acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She was falling in love with Richard Beaufort, Marquess of Helmsley. It was foolish, dangerous, and completely contrary to their arrangement, but her heart paid no attention to logic or propriety. The morning of the gathering arrived with spring sunshine and a sense of anticipation that permeated the entire household. Eleanor was dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that brought out the color of her eyes. Sapphires that had belonged to the Marquess's mother were placed around her neck and at her ears. Annie arranged her hair in an elaborate style that took nearly 2 hours to complete. When Eleanor finally descended to the main floor, she found the Marquess waiting at the bottom of the stairs. He was dressed in formal evening attire, looking every inch the powerful aristocrat he was. But when he saw her, his expression softened into something that made Eleanor's heart race. "You look beautiful," he said quietly. "Thank you, my lord." "Richard," he corrected. "I think we have moved beyond such formality, Eleanor." The use of her given name sent warmth flooding through her. "Richard, then." He offered his arm. "Shall we face society together?" "Together," Eleanor agreed, placing her hand on his arm. The first guests began arriving promptly at 8 o'clock. Eleanor stood beside the Marquess in the receiving line, aware of the scrutiny, the whispered comments, the barely concealed curiosity. Lady Winthrop arrived early and greeted Eleanor with genuine warmth. Other ladies followed, some friendly, others coldly assessing. It was when Lady Victoria Fairfax arrived that Eleanor felt the first true stirrings of unease. Lady Victoria was beautiful in the way that society prized, with golden hair, perfect features, and a figure that her rose silk gown displayed to advantage. She was also, Eleanor had learned, a woman who had expected to become the Marchioness of Helmsley. "Lord Helmsley," Lady Victoria said, her voice like honey over steel. "How delightful to see you again, and this must be the mysterious Miss Ashby I have heard so much about." "Lady Victoria," the Marquess replied with cool politeness. "May I indeed present my betrothed, Miss Eleanor Ashby?" "Charming," Lady Victoria said, her eyes sweeping over Eleanor with clear dismissal. "I do hope you are finding London to your taste, Miss Ashby. It must be quite different from wherever you came from." "Indeed it is, Lady Victoria," Eleanor replied evenly, "though I have found that kindness and good breeding exist in all stations of life, just as cruelty and small-mindedness can be found even in the highest circles." Lady Victoria's eyes narrowed dangerously, but before she could respond, the Dowager appeared at Eleanor's elbow. "Lady Victoria, how kind of you to attend. Your mother sends her regrets, I understand. Such a pity. Do come in and enjoy the refreshments." As more guests arrived, Eleanor found herself navigating a complex web of social interactions. Some were genuinely friendly, curious about the young woman who had captured the Marquess's attention. Others were openly hostile, viewing her as an interloper. And a few, like Lady Winthrop, seemed to be observing with bemused interest how Eleanor handled herself. The musical entertainment began at 9 o'clock. A professional soprano sang arias that made the windows tremble. A violinist executed a virtuoso piece that left the audience breathless, and then the Dowager announced that Miss Ashby would honor them with a performance on the pianoforte. Eleanor felt panic claw at her throat. This had not been part of the plan, but the Dowager's expression was implacable, and Eleanor realized this was the final test. She could refuse and be seen as lacking in accomplishment, or she could perform and risk exposing her still modest skills to a room full of critical observers. She chose to perform. Eleanor seated herself at the pianoforte, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the keys. She had chosen a Mozart sonata, not the most technically demanding, but one that required precision and feeling. For a moment, she sat frozen, the weight of 40 pairs of eyes pressing down on her like a physical force. Then she thought of her father, whose belief in education was absolute. She thought of the Dowager who had pushed her beyond what she thought possible. She thought of Richard, standing somewhere in the room, watching her with those dark, intense eyes. She began to play. The notes flowed from her fingers, not perfectly, but with genuine emotion. Eleanor stopped worrying about technique and simply let herself feel the music, the way Richard had taught her during their dance. The sonata was not a brilliant performance that would be talked about for weeks, but it was competent, heartfelt, and showed evidence of genuine accomplishment. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence. Then applause, polite but real, spread across the floor. Eleanor rose and curtsied, her heart still pounding. She had not humiliated herself. That was victory enough. The rest of the evening felt like a series of bright, fragmented moments, conversations, refreshments, and careful navigation of social niceties. Eleanor found herself speaking with ladies about literature, with gentlemen about politics, and with everyone about the upcoming season. She made no egregious errors, committed no unforgivable breaches of etiquette. It was nearing midnight when Lady Victoria approached Eleanor in a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom. The look in her eyes held a clear intent to wound. "You have done remarkably well this evening, Miss Ashby," Lady Victoria said, her tone making the compliment sound like an insult. "Truly, no one would suspect that just 3 months ago you were living in St. Giles, about to be sold to a brothel." The words were spoken just loudly enough to carry to the small group of people nearby. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as shocked whispers began to spread through the room like wildfire. She saw the Dowager turn sharply, saw Richard begin to move toward her, but it was already too late. The damage was done. Eleanor could have denied it. She could have claimed Lady Victoria was lying, but that would be both dishonest and futile. Instead, she lifted her chin and met Lady Victoria's triumphant gaze with steady eyes. "You are quite right, Lady Victoria," Eleanor said clearly, her voice carrying through the sudden silence. 3 months ago I was living in St. Giles. My stepfather, a gambler and a drunk, sold me to settle his debts. Lord Helmsley witnessed this transaction and intervened, saving me from a fate worse than death. The room was absolutely silent now. Every eye was fixed on Eleanor, judgment and shock written clearly on dozens of faces. "I make no apologies for my circumstances," Eleanor continued. "I did not choose my stepfather, nor did I choose the poverty into which his actions thrust me, but I did choose to work with every fiber of my being to better myself when given the opportunity. The Dowager Marchioness has been kind enough to train me in accomplishments that most ladies spend their entire lives learning. If that makes me unworthy of your company, then I accept that judgment. But I will not apologize for surviving, for fighting, or for having the courage to transform my life." The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then Richard was at her side, his hand settling possessively at the small of her back. "Miss Ashby's honesty and courage are precisely the qualities that compel my profound admiration and affection," he said, his voice ringing with absolute conviction. "Anyone who finds that objectionable is welcome to leave. As for those who choose to remain, I expect the respect due to the future Marchioness of Helmsley." Eleanor's head snapped toward him, her eyes searching his face, suddenly unable to read her fate. Had he truly just said he loved her? Or was this merely an act to protect her reputation? He looked at her, his expression utterly without reservation or guile, and the sincerity was palpable. Lady Victoria turned and swept from the room. A dozen guests hurried in her wake, who clearly found Eleanor's background too scandalous to overlook. But the majority remained, and Eleanor was surprised to hear Lady Winthrop give a sharp, clear clap. "Well said, Lord Helmsley," Lady Winthrop declared. "I for one am delighted that you have found a woman of substance rather than simply another empty-headed beauty. Miss Ashby, you have my full support." Others joined in the applause, some enthusiastically, others more reservedly, but it was clear that the room was divided. Eleanor had become a subject of scandal and fascination in equal measure. The gathering continued for another hour, but the easy atmosphere had been shattered. Guests departed in twos and threes, and Eleanor could hear the speculation that would soon spread through all of London society. She had been exposed, her origins laid bare for all to judge. When the last guest finally departed, Eleanor found herself alone with Richard and the Dowager in the drawing room. She felt hollow, exhausted beyond measure. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "Lady Victoria destroyed any hope that I could be accepted as your wife. You should dissolve our engagement immediately, before more damage is done to your reputation." "Absolutely not," the Dowager said firmly. "Miss Ashby, you handled yourself with remarkable dignity this evening. Many women of impeccable breeding would have crumbled under such an attack. You stood your ground with honesty and grace. I am proud of you." She paused, then added, "Moreover, the scandal has given Richard the perfect moral shield to proceed, transforming gossip into romance. But society will never fully accept me now." "Society is fickle," Richard said, moving to stand before her. "Today you are a scandal. Tomorrow, if we handle this correctly, you will be a romantic figure who overcame adversity. And the day after that, something new will catch their attention, and you will simply be the Marchioness of Helmsley." "You cannot truly wish to marry me?" Eleanor asked. "Our arrangement was for 3 months. You said yourself you had no desire for a real marriage." "I was wrong." Richard took her hands in his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "These past 3 months, watching you transform, not because you sought status or wealth, but because you refused to be defeated by circumstance, I came to admire you, and admiration became something deeper. Eleanor, I do not care about your origins. I care about your character, your intelligence, your strength. Those are the qualities I want in a wife." Eleanor felt a sharp, hot wave of emotion behind her eyes. "But I am nobody, Richard. The daughter of a schoolmaster, raised in poverty, nearly sold into prostitution. How can you possibly love someone like me?" "How can I not?" He raised her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You are the bravest person I have ever known, and if you will have me, I would be honored to make you my wife in truth." The Dowager cleared her throat delicately. "I believe this is where I make my exit, and leave you two to speak privately. Miss Ashby, the wager is decided. You have exceeded every expectation. I consider my part fulfilled and eagerly await the wedding." After the Dowager departed, Eleanor looked up at Richard, searching his face for any sign of doubt or pity. She found neither. What she saw instead was respect, admiration, and yes, love. "I do not know when it happened," Eleanor confessed, "but somewhere between the pianoforte lessons and the dancing and the endless memorization of genealogy, I fell in love with you too. I told myself it was foolish, that our arrangement was temporary, but my heart refused to listen." "Then perhaps both our hearts are wiser than we are," Richard said. He brought her hand to rest against his chest. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had begun to spill down her cheeks. "Eleanor Ashby, will you do me the very great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "Yes, Richard, I will." He kissed her then, and Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumble. This was not the desperate kiss of a woman who had no choices. This was the kiss of a woman who had chosen her own destiny, who had fought for her place in the world, and who had found love in the most unexpected of places. The weeks that followed were not easy. Lady Victoria's revelation had created exactly the scandal Eleanor had feared. Some doors closed to her. Some invitations were pointedly not extended, but other doors opened. Lady Winthrop championed Eleanor in society, and others followed her lead. The Dowager made it clear that anyone who snubbed her future granddaughter-in-law would find themselves excluded from the most important social events of the season. More importantly, Eleanor discovered that she no longer cared quite so much what society thought. The cutting remarks of jealous ladies paled in comparison to the dangers she had faced. The wedding took place 6 weeks after the gathering at Helmsley House. It was held not in London, but at Richard's country estate in Northumberland, a sprawling property of stunning beauty. The ceremony was small and intimate, attended only by those who genuinely cared for Eleanor and Richard, rather than those who chase influence. Eleanor wore a gown of ivory silk with lace that had belonged to Richard's mother. The Dowager, who had become a true grandmother to Eleanor in recent months, helped her dress and placed a tiara of sapphires on her head. "You have come a long way from St. Giles, my dear girl," the Dowager said, her voice soft. "And you did it through your own efforts, your own strength. Never forget that." "I could not have done it without you, Your Grace," Eleanor said. "You believed in me when I barely believed in myself." "Nonsense. I simply helped you become what you already were, a lady of true nobility." The ceremony was beautiful in its simplicity. Eleanor walked down the aisle of the small chapel on the estate, past friends who smiled with genuine happiness. At the altar waited Richard, handsome in his formal attire, his eyes filled with love and pride. They spoke their vows in voices that carried clearly through the chapel. When Richard slipped the wedding ring onto Eleanor's finger, she felt the symbolic weight of it, the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine. The wedding breakfast unfolded as a joyous affair, filled with laughter, music, and heartfelt speeches. Lady Winthrop gave a speech that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Even the Dowager, normally so reserved, wiped at her eyes during Richard's toast to his bride. As the sun began to set, Eleanor and Richard stood together on the terrace overlooking the estate grounds. The spring evening was mild, and the scent of blooming flowers filled the air. "Happy?" Richard asked, his arm around her waist. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible," Eleanor said honestly. 3 months ago I was facing a nightmare. Now I am married to a man I love, surrounded by people who care for me, with a future full of possibility." "You earned every bit of it," Richard said firmly. "Never doubt that, Eleanor. Your transformation was not because I rescued you or because my grandmother trained you. It was because you possessed the strength and determination to seize the opportunity when it came." "We both transformed," Eleanor said, looking up at him. "You told me once you had no desire to marry. Yet here you are, a husband." "I had no desire to marry for duty or dynasty," Richard corrected, "but marrying for love, for partnership, for the joy of building a life with someone remarkable. That is something different entirely." He kissed her as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose, and Eleanor felt a sense of peace she had never known. The road ahead would not be without challenges. Some in society would never fully accept her. There would be whispers and speculation for years to come, but she had faced far worse and survived. With Richard at her side, she could face anything. 5 years passed with the swift grace of happiness. Eleanor proved to be an exceptional marchioness, managing the household with efficiency and warmth. She became known for her charitable works, particularly her establishment of a school for girls in St. Giles, funded by her own allowance and open to any child regardless of circumstances. The school bore her father's name, a tribute to the man who had believed that education could forge lives. Eleanor taught there herself one day each week, sharing the knowledge her father had given her and the accomplishments the Dowager had taught her. The girls who attended learned not just how to be servants or companions, but how to think, to read, to calculate, to dream of futures beyond their current circumstances. 3 children came to bless the marriage, 2 sons and a daughter. Eleanor insisted they learn not just the accomplishments of their class, but also the value of hard work, the importance of education, and the truth that nobility of character mattered far more than nobility of birth. The Dowager, now 75 years old, remained a fixture in their lives. She doted on her great-grandchildren with a softness that would have astonished anyone who remembered her former severity. On quiet evenings, she and Eleanor would sit together in the drawing room at Helmsley House, and the older woman would share stories of her own youth, of the challenges she had faced, of the strength she had found. "When I first came to this house," she confessed one evening, "I spent an entire year convincing my husband's family that I was worthy of the name I bore. You did it in 3 months, my dear. You have taught me that true worth speaks louder than the most cunning strategy. You remind me of myself," the dowager said one such evening. "Not as I was when you met me, all sharp edges and impossible standards, but as I was when I was young, fighting to prove myself worthy of my position. You have taught me something, Eleanor. That transformation is possible at any age, and that the heart can always learn to love more deeply. As for Mr. Blackwell, he died in New South Wales, his schemes and cruelties catching up with him in the end." Eleanor felt neither triumph nor grief at the news, only a distant pity for a man who had wasted his life in pursuit of empty pleasures. Mrs. Dalton's establishment was closed by authorities, its practices finally brought to light through Richard's influence and the testimony of women Eleanor had helped to rescue. Lady Victoria married a wealthy baron and moved to Scotland, removing herself from London society. Eleanor heard of her occasionally and felt no resentment. Lady Victoria had, in her cruel way, forced the truth into the open and perhaps hastened the resolution of Eleanor's true feelings for Richard. On their 5th anniversary, Richard gave Eleanor a gift, a leather-bound journal filled with blank pages. "For what?" Eleanor asked, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "For our daughters," Richard said. "Write down your story, Eleanor. Everything that happened, everything you overcame, everything you learned, so that if they ever face their own challenges, they will know that their mother was the bravest woman I have ever known, and that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle." Eleanor began writing that very evening. She wrote about St. Giles and the morning she had been sold like property. She wrote about Richard's intervention and the wager with the dowager. She wrote about the brutal lessons, the painful transformations, and the moment she realized she had fallen in love. She wrote about Lady Victoria's revelation and the scandal that followed. But most of all, she wrote about hope. Hope that circumstances do not define destiny. Hope that education and determination can open doors thought forever closed. Hope that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that second chances, when seized with courage, can lead to lives more beautiful than any dream. In the final pages, Eleanor addressed her daughter directly. "My dearest child, if you are reading this, know that nobility is not inherited but chosen. It is found in acts of kindness, in moments of courage, in the decision to rise above circumstances rather than be defined by them. Your grandmother, the formidable dowager, taught me that grace and dignity can be learned. Your father taught me that love is not about perfection, but about seeing the true worth in another person. And life itself taught me that the most valuable quality any person can possess is the determination to never surrender, no matter how dark the circumstances may seem. You carry in your blood the legacy of a schoolmaster whose belief in education was absolute, a Marquess dedicated to justice, and a mother who refused to be defeated. Whatever challenges you face, remember this: you are stronger than you know, braver than you believe, and worthy of every dream you dare to dream. Choose courage. Choose kindness. Choose to believe in yourself and know that you are loved beyond measure." Eleanor set down her pen and looked out the window of the library at Helmsley House. In the garden below, her children played under the watchful eye of their nurse, while Richard consulted with his estate manager. The dowager sat in her favorite chair near the window, a piece of embroidery in her lap. Her eyes followed the children with obvious affection. This was her life now. Not perfect, for no life is perfect, but good, so very good, and all because one man had seen past her circumstances to the woman beneath, and because she had found the courage to believe she was worthy of the chance he offered. Eleanor closed the journal and placed it carefully in a drawer of her desk. Someday her children would read it. Someday they would understand the full story of how their mother became a marchioness. But for now, She would simply live this beautiful life she had fought so hard to claim. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Helmsley House, bathing the hall in a luminous golden clarity. Eleanor stood and walked to join her family in the garden, her heart full of gratitude for the unexpected journey that had brought her from despair to joy, from darkness to light, from St. Giles to her rightful place as the woman who had earned, through courage and determination, the title she now bore with pride, the Marchioness of Helmsley. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this remarkable journey. If Eleanor's story of courage, transformation, and unexpected love touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of hope, resilience, and the power of second chances. We are deeply grateful you chose to spend this time with us.